A candle dies with a single breath, yet no one was there. Welcome to Ico Misteriosa. I am your host Avella. Tell me where you're listening from. Your comments light up this journey. Now, let's begin the tale. The winter of '89 had laid a grey film over London, and Baker Street looked as though the city had breathed upon the window panes and refused to wipe them clear. Holmes had returned from some unholy hour's perambulation in the fog, his ulster powdered with damp, and was coaxing melancholy phrases from the violin when Mrs. Hudson ushered in a visitor so muffled in shawls that, until she unwound herself, I could not have sworn to her sex. She proved a spare, weathered woman with a face sharpened by a long habit of frugality, the sort of face that carries its own lantern of resolve behind the eyes. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said to Holmes, remaining upright upon the threshold as if even a chair must be earned. "They told me at the desk I must give my name. I am Mrs. Mornabel." Holmes set down the violin and, without rising, indicated the hearthrug with 2 fingers. "Mrs. Mornabel, housekeeper to Sir Felix Mortimer, late of Mortimer House, Cloak Lane City, widowed these 4 years. No children, a Highland habit of thrift preserved even in service. Your shoes, madam, have the fine white of office chalk, not the red of the outer streets. Your sleeve bears a wafer of beeswax, and the perfume is not yours orris root, a gentleman's vanity. Perhaps from a drawer you opened this morning while it was yet dark." Her mouth formed a little O of wonder, the old, honest astonishment I confess the first still relish, however often I have witnessed it. "If you can see all that, sir," she said with a tremor, "then you can perhaps see how a candle may be snuffed by a breath when no mouth is near it, and a man die in the very instant the wick goes cold. Sit down, Mrs. Bell," said Holmes, and the violin's low complaint ceased to haunt the room. "You have come from Cloak Lane. You walked, I think, because the fog sits low and you mistrust cabs to find an honest lane under it. Take breath, and tell us all." We drew her near the fire, and I took out my notebook, though I could not yet imagine how breath and candle could have any hand in murder. There was nothing supernatural about our cases. Holmes would not have suffered it, but she had contrived to put frost under my skin nonetheless. "It were last night," she began, "and not as late as a city keeps, but late enough for honest servants to want their beds. Sir Felix had dismissed the clerks by 9, save Mr. Raymond Preece, his secretary, who sat outside the study door with the books. The gas in the study has a habit of sputtering and was turned off for fear of explosion. Sir Felix, being old-fashioned in some ways, had set a single beeswax candle on his I had trimmed it myself and fetched the snuffer out of the drawer to be at hand, for he was not to burn down the house for the sake of a memorandum. She paused to gather her shawl more closely about her shoulders. Holmes's eyes had sharpened at the mention of gas. "Proceed." "Sir Felix had received 2 callers that evening," Mrs. Bell continued, though he saw only one. "The first was Mr. Percival Mortimer, his nephew by his late brother, come at 8:30. They had words in the hall, but Sir Felix would not be kept from his papers and sent the gentleman away. The second was Mr. Angus McCrae from the Home Office, who came at 9:15 with a sealed bag of some papers they say could not wait till morning. Sir Felix bade him leave them and be off. He locked himself in the study thereafter, as is his custom when he is reading private." "And the house was quiet?" I asked. "As quiet as a parish in snow," she said. "I kept the maids to the back corridor so their clatter should not disturb." At 10:05, Mr. Preece rose to take him his draught, which I had poured and set upon a tray. He tapped. Sir Felix called, "Not now." Mr. Preece sat again. "And then, sirs, then the candle went out." She said it very softly, as though the act itself were a profanity. Holmes turned his face more fully toward her. "You saw it?" he asked. "No, but the door has a and a thin cut of light will lie upon the right-hand skirting when a flame is near the desk." Mr. Preece, who has the eyes of a linnet, saw the light quiver, gutter, and vanish, all in a long second. "There was no draught. We keep the windows in that room sealed for the gas, and the snuffer was still in the drawer." Mr. Preece called out, "Sir." There was no answer. He knocked. Then, God forgive him, he took the key from his pocket and opened the door. "Sir Felix kept a second key," said Holmes. "He did not. Mr. Preece has had the steward's key these 7 years for when Sir Felix dozes among his papers. He swears he never opens without permission. When he turned the lock, the door gave, and in the dark he could hear Sir Felix's chair go back as if he had started up. Mr. Preece found the matches, struck one, and cried out for me. I ran in. Sir Felix was fallen sideways across the escritoire, his hand halfway to the bell-cord, and the beeswax candle stood before him, blacked at the wick, cold, and not a breath of smoke in the air. On the blotter there was a smear where his pen had trailed, and the sealed bag lay open with the papers within. She stopped there, and the only sound was the hiss of the coal. I confess that my imagination, ill-disciplined compared to Holmes's, created a dozen childish explanations, each more fanciful than the last. "Was he dead?" I said at last. "Not at once," Mrs. Bell whispered. There was a gasp, one only, and then no more. Dr. Ellison was fetched in 3 minutes, for he lodges not 2 doors away, but Sir Felix was past 8. The doctor said, if you will pardon my repeating, he said it was like a stoppage of the heart. But Sir Felix was hale yesterday morning and took his porridge like a ploughman. I tell you there was a wickedness in it. And the candle, she broke off, unable to master the terror of that little household object. Lestrade, Holmes asked, as though he were in the room already. He came within the half hour, Mr. Holmes. He says there was no one in the passage and no marks upon the sill. The windows were dogged. The chimney was clean as of last week. The door, her face puckered. He says Mr. Priest must have been mistaken and Sir Felix died of his own heart in the instant the candle failed. Perhaps the wick drowned, says he. And you all made a mystery where there is none. But I trimmed that wick myself, sir, and I know the way of wax. And this morning, she added in a smaller voice, I found the snuffer, not in its drawer, but set upon the mantel, sooty within, as if someone had lifted it in the dark and then changed his mind. Holmes, who had appeared to be receiving her account as impassively as a sphinx, now rose and went to the window. He drew with his forefinger a small circle upon the fogged pane and examined the damp pattern as though it were a cipher. Tell me, he said without turning, was there a taste upon the air in that room? Not the ordinary sour of extinguished tallow, but something clean, as of wintergreen, or something bitter. Mrs. Bell started. Sir, I thought I fancied it. A nip in the nostril, like the chemist's shop when one passes the jars. Horace, murmured Holmes. And beeswax, as you say. He faced us once more, all indolence gone from his posture. You have done wisely to come, Mrs. Bell. There is more, she said, twisting her shawl. In the morning, when I took up the blotter for, I would have set his things to rights before the city men come. I found upon the green baize a dusting, like the finest soot, but laid in a half-moon toward the keyhole, and upon the key itself a smear, as if a sooty finger had touched it. A half-moon, said Holmes, and his eyes quickened. Very pretty. Dr. Watson, pray, make a note. Half-moon soot on blotter. Faint odor reminiscent of wintergreen. Snuffer displaced. Candle extinguished without smoke. Sealed bag opened. Secretary with key in pocket. Nephew turned away. Home office courier departed. Gas off. Windows sealed. You will come, sir, Mrs. Bell said. It was not a question, really. It was a plea that had already decided its own answer. Holmes glanced at the clock upon the mantel, one that loses a minute every fortnight, and then at the fog that pressed its cheek like a damp child against the glass. Mrs. Bell, you may inform Inspector Lestrade that Mr. Sherlock Holmes will pay his respects to Sir Felix within the hour. Watson, your coat. As I struggled into my greatcoat, for the cold had a way of making itself a third presence in the room, I saw Holmes's gaze fall upon a little speck of wax upon the cuff of Mrs. Bell's left sleeve. He did not remark upon it. He seldom does upon the first telling, preferring to let his facts ripen unbruised. But as we descended the stairs, he said under his breath, so lightly that I could imagine I had not heard, a breath can snuff a candle. My dear Watson, if one provides the breath with a mouth, the question is whose mouth and from what distance. I cannot imagine. Said I know, he answered, and his tone was not unkind. That is why you are invaluable. And with that enigmatic compliment we stepped out into the soup of London, toward Cloak Lane and the study where a candle had gone dark, and, with it, a man. The fog clung about us like damp wool as we drove eastward, the handsome lamps glimmering against a curtain of mist so dense that even the horse seemed reluctant to pierce it. Holmes sat folded into himself, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed as though in meditation. I have learned never to mistake this attitude for idleness. It is then that his mind works most swiftly, arranging the fragments of fact into a pattern invisible to the rest of us. When at last we reached Cloak Lane, Mrs. Bell led us through a narrow vestibule that smelled faintly of wax and stale smoke. The servants had gathered in whispers along the passage, their faces pale from a night without sleep. At the far end, beyond a baize door, lay the study in which Sir Felix Mortimer had met his strange death. Holmes paused before the threshold and held up a finger, commanding silence. He bent his head toward the keyhole, inhaled, and then tapped the lintel lightly. The draught runs downward. Watson, he murmured, do you perceive it? I pressed my palm against the jamb but felt nothing. If so, it escapes my notice. Precisely. Holmes smiled faintly. That is what makes it remarkable. He motioned us inside. The room was somber, paneled in oak, with ledgers ranged like sentries upon the shelves. The great escritoire stood in the center, its blotter still bearing the faint half-moon mark Mrs. Bell had described. A candle rested there, unlit, its wick short and blackened. Holmes went at once to the mantel, where the brass snuffer lay. He turned it in his hand, sniffed, and made a low sound of satisfaction. A trace of oil, he said, and something acrid beneath it. Observe the soot within, no ordinary carbon, but finer, more metallic. He handed it to me, though to my nose it carried only the faintest medicinal sting. While I puzzled over this, Holmes had moved to the carpet beneath the desk. He dropped to his knees, running his lens along the pile. Here is where the chair toppled. And here is Watson. Look closely, grains of some dark powder driven into the fibers. They lie in a crescent, as Mrs. Bell reported, but notice how they trail outward toward the keyhole. That is not the dispersal of a candle's smoke. It is the trace of something introduced from beyond the door. Introduced how? I asked. By by a mouth as I remarked, though not a human one pressed to the wood. No, Watson, imagine. Instead, an apparatus metallic narrow, capable of carrying breath where no lips might reach. The sooty arc is its signature. Before I could question further, the door opened behind us and Inspector Lestrade entered, brisk and officious, his bowler still glistening from the fog. Ah, Mr. Holmes, I had word you would be met assisting. He corrected himself with a wry twist. I hope you find more than I have, for I see only a gentleman struck down by apoplexy. Holmes inclined his head. An apoplexy which extinguishes candles without smoke. Pray enlighten me. Inspector Lestrade shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. A coincidence, nothing more. The wick drowned, the gentleman's heart failed, and you have the making of a legend. I prefer to keep my feet upon solid paving stones. Holmes regarded him coolly. And yet the paving stones of Cloak Lane are ill-laid tonight. Permit me then to tread the air. He turned back to the desk. Where are the papers delivered by Mr. McCrae? In the strong box, Lestrade replied. The secretary sealed them this morning. Nothing amiss there. M.M. and the nephew Percival Mortimer. An ambitious young man, said Lestrade. But, with an alibi, he was seen at the Albion Club not half an hour after his uncle dismissed him. Several members will swear to it. Holmes's eyes flickered with amusement. Alibis are often too conveniently attested. I shall speak with him myself. But first, Mr. Preece, if you please. The secretary, a nervous fellow with ink-stained fingers, stepped hesitantly into the doorway. He bowed to Holmes, then clutched his ledger as if it were a shield. I have told Inspector Lestrade all I know, sir. Then repeat it, Holmes commanded. Every word as though the moment lived again. Preece swallowed hard and described the extinguishing of the candle, the silence and the discovery of his master across the desk. Holmes listened intently, watching not the man's face but his hands, which trembled upon the leather cover. You say you keep a steward's key? Holmes pressed. How long between Sir Felix's dismissal of you and your opening of the door? Perhaps 5 minutes. No more. And during that interval, you heard no sound from within? None, sir, save that sudden gasp when the light went out. I thought, 'tit shames me to say I thought my master sighed at the weariness of his labors. Holmes's gaze grew keener. And the odor, you remarked it. Preece hesitated. A sharpness, yes, like spirits of night. I thought it some chemical Sir Felix used for sealing. Holmes dismissed him with a nod and paced back to the mantel. He stood there, eyes half-lidded, while Lestrade shifted impatiently. I could almost hear the machinery of his thought. At last he said, Watson, note this, the nephew with motive, the secretary with means, and the courier with opportunity. Each leaves a thread, yet the tapestry is unfinished. There remains the question of how a breath, guided through keyhole and candle, might bring death so swiftly. Until we answer that, we have no case. Lestrade gave a short laugh. And you expect to conjure it out of soot and fancy. Very well, Mr. Holmes, I'll humor you. But do not be surprised when the coroner's report leaves you with nothing more than an extinguished candle in a dead man's heart. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. On the contrary, Inspector, I expect it will give us precisely the poison we require. With that cryptic remark, he turned abruptly toward the door. Come, Watson, we have an appointment at the Albion Club. There is a nephew who must account not only for his words, but for the breath he did not spend. The hansom wheels rattled briskly as we crossed the bridge into the heart of the city. Holmes silent beside me, save for the occasional low hum that betrayed his inward calculations. His lean frame leaned forward now, his eyes alive with a fire that I had come to know Wilson of some conception forming that he would not yet share. I ventured no interruption, for I had learned that his mind, once upon the scent, must run its course unhindered. The Albion Club loomed in all its somber majesty, its facade lit by gas lamps that cast long hesitant shadows across the damp pavement. Within, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and the murmur of well-bred voices. We were shown at once to a chamber where Percival Mortimer awaited, apparently forewarned of our call. He was a man of perhaps 35, well-dressed, to the point of ostentation. His cravat nodded with studied carelessness. His eyes, however, betrayed a restless spirit. They flickered toward the door with each footfall in the corridor, as though fearing some spectre would enter. My uncle's death has shocked me beyond words, he began, rising to greet us with a bow that carried the faintest trace of mockery. But I cannot pretend to be surprised that Scotland Yard is sniffing after me so soon. They have always admired the straightest path, even when it leads nowhere. An interesting observation, said Holmes, his tone light, almost conversational. But you will forgive us if we prefer to take our own path. Pray tell me, Mr. Mortimer, what business brought you to Cloak Lane last evening? The young man hesitated. The business of inheritance, if you must know. My uncle was stubborn, but not blind. He had no direct heir, and it was only natural he should provide for me. Did he say as much? Holmes asked. He said nothing, but his silence was more eloquent than words. Mortimer smiled thinly. I pressed him. He dismissed me. I left straight to the Albion. Holmes's gaze sharpened. To be sure, several gentlemen of the club can attest to my presence. At 9:30, I was seated at whist. Holmes inclined his head. And before that, between your uncle's dismissal and your arrival here, the smile faltered. I walked Is a man not permitted to compose himself after an affront? It was 10 minutes, no more. 10 minutes, Holmes repeated softly, as though measuring the interval upon a scale. He turned away, his eyes sweeping the portraits upon the walls. Tell me, Mr. Mortimer, do you ever amuse yourself with chemistry? Chemistry? The nephew looked genuinely bewildered. I know, sir. My amusements are more terrestrial: cards, horses, and the occasional wager. Of course, murmured Holmes. He produced a pinch of the dark residue he had gathered upon his fingertip from Sir Felix's carpet. Then you will not recognize this. Mortimer recoiled slightly. It looks like soot. Holmes returned the fragment to a small envelope. So it does. Yet appearances, like nephews, may deceive. One final question. Did your uncle ever speak of documents received from the Home Office? The young man's brows knit. Government papers. He was ever dabbling in matters beyond his estate. I knew nothing of them. If you suggest, I suggest nothing, said Holmes smoothly. We merely collect threads. You have been most obliging. We left the Albion with Mortimer's uneasy glance following us, though Holmes appeared in no hurry to interpret it. As we hailed another cab, I could not contain myself. You suspect him still, Holmes? I suspect everyone, my dear Watson, until the facts acquit them. The nephew has motive enough, yet no man extinguishes a candle with chemicals from a gaming hall. There is an unseen hand at work, and we must not let the obvious distract us. Our next call was to the lodgings of Mr. Angus McCrae, the courier from the Home Office. He received us in a small, neat chamber off Whitehall, his manner brisk and professional, though not without a guarded air. He was a Highlander of stern countenance, the type who measures his words as a mason lays stone. I did deliver the bag, he confirmed, sealed and proper. Sir Felix received it in my presence, and I left him with it. That is all. Holmes's gaze lingered upon him. And the contents? You knew nothing of them, nor would I, sir. My duty is carriage, not curiosity. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Yet you carry, by your own account, the affairs of state. Surely you are schooled against interference. McCrae's lips pressed thin. I am, and I resent the implication. Holmes raised a hand. No implication, merely observation. Yet tell me, did you notice aught unusual in Sir Felix's demeanor? Any anxiety, any gesture that betrayed unease? McCrae thought. He seemed preoccupied. But such men always do, buried in papers and plots. He urged me away quickly, as though the house itself were a vault he wished locked behind me. Holmes bowed slightly. You have been precise, sir. Precision is invaluable. As we departed, Holmes's features betrayed no sign of triumph. He was deep in thought, his steps brisk, his eyes bright as he turned once more to me. Watson, we stand at the threshold of a design most curious. Consider. A candle snuffed in silence, a heart arrested in the very breath of extinguishment, a secretary trembling with the key, a nephew restless with expectation, a courier departing with no desire to linger. Each gives us a portion, yet the sum eludes us, and the soot. I ask, the soot is the whisper of the truth. I must confirm it. Tomorrow, we return to Cloak Lane with certain instruments. Tonight, however, I shall consult a chemist whose knowledge of vapors surpasses even mine. Only then shall we know how a breath, guided through iron and brass, may kill a man without a mark upon his body. And with that pronouncement, he hailed a cab for Holborn, leaving me to marvel at how swiftly the night had transformed from candlelight into chemical suspicion, and how each word spoken by those we questioned seemed to draw the noose tighter, though around which neck I could not yet tell. Holmes had the cab halt before a narrow shop tucked between two shuttered warehouses, its window filled with stoppered vials whose contents glimmered like captured smoke. The sign above bore the faded legend H. Vanes, chemist and purveyor of scientific apparatus. A bell tinkled as we entered, and the proprietor, a tall, hawk-nosed fellow in a stained apron, emerged from behind a curtain with an expression of recognition. Mr. Holmes, he said, bowing slightly, you keep odd hours. As does science, Vanes. Holmes replied. I require your opinion on a residue. He produced the envelope of soot, spreading it with care upon a glass slide. Vanes bent over, adjusting his spectacles, and within a few moments had set the fragment beneath a curious lamp whose violet glow threw the grains into stark relief. Ah, the chemist murmured. You have here a precipitate of antimony and arsenic oxide, very fine, crystallized in soot by the flame of a taper, I should think. But how came you by it? Holmes's eyes gleamed. That, my dear Vanes, is the question. You confirm it could be dispersed by combustion. Indeed, heat it in a flame, it gives forth a vapor most noxious. One could scarcely endure it for a moment without collapse. Fatal, if taken deep into the lungs. I felt a chill despite the close air of the shop. Holmes, however, only nodded as though this confirmed an expectation, that a candle, doctored with such a substance, could exhale death when snuffed suddenly, the vapor thrust outward through a narrow vent. Most assuredly, the wick itself would be the crucible, a devilish contrivance. Holmes thanked him, and we departed. Holmes pacing swiftly now, his cloak streaming behind him. There lies our method, Watson, he said, his voice low and eager. A poisoned breath, guided through the keyhole. expelled upon the unsuspecting victim in the instant of the candle's extinction. The half-moon of soot was its signature, the strange odor its announcement. Sir Felix did not die of apoplexy. He was murdered by design, with chemistry as the assassin's hand, and the hand that wielded it. I pressed, there is the knot. The nephew has motive, the secretary possession of the key, the courier opportunity. But the instrument, where is it? Until we find it, we are in the realm of conjecture. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the fog had thinned, but the first pale light of dawn had begun to color the sky. Holmes refused rest. He ordered strong coffee and summoned me to the table where he had laid out his notes in a neat array. Consider the sequence, Watson. At 8:30, Percival Mortimer quarrels with his uncle and is dismissed. At 8:45, Angus McCrae delivers his sealed bag. By 10:50, the candle gutters. Sir Felix gasps and is found dying. Within that interval, someone introduced the fatal apparatus. The secretary claims never to have left his post. The nephew claims he walked here to the club. The courier claims he went straight back to Whitehall. One lies or conceals half the truth. I pondered this in silence as Holmes sketched a crude diagram of the study, marking the door, desk, and chair. His pencil stabbed at the keyhole. The weapon must have been slender enough to pass here, yet stout enough to carry the vapor of combustion. A tube, Watson, no longer than my arm, tipped with a snuffer to extinguish the flame at the precise moment. You believe the snuffer found upon the mantel was part of it? Undoubtedly. Placed there in haste, perhaps forgotten in the dark. That alone makes our murderer clumsy and, therefore, vulnerable. At that instant there came a sharp rap at the door, and Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Leslie, looking none the better for a night spent in official duty. He carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper, which he set down upon the table. This was found in the alley behind Mortimer House this morning, he said, untying the string. One of my men thought it rubbish, but I recalled your interest. Looks like a bit of plumbing to me. Holmes sprang forward with a cry of satisfaction. Within lay a slender length of brass tubing, darkened at one end, and a snuffer that bore unmistakable traces of soot. Holmes examined it with rapt delight, running his lens along the join where tube met cone. Admirable, he exclaimed. Here is our mouthpiece. See how the soot forms the same arc I observed upon the blotter. Lestrade, I congratulate your man on stumbling upon more truth than all your apoplexy theories could contrive. Lestrade scowled. And what does it prove? A bit of pipe in an alley is hardly a noose for any man's neck. Holmes's eyes glittered. It proves method, Inspector. Now we need only pair it with motive and opportunity. And that, I think, we shall accomplish today. Watson, we must return to Cloak Lane at once. The house itself will tell us which of its inhabitants played host to this device. We set out again, Lestrade reluctantly accompanying us. As we rattled eastward, Holmes sat upright, the tube across his knees like a hunter's rifle. His mind was clearly arranging the facts into some larger symmetry. Watson, he said at last, observe how fortune favors us. The secretary sat outside the very door. The courier entered but briefly, with his parcel. The nephew lingered in the hall in plain view, and yet this device was employed. Which of them possessed both the privacy to prepare it and the knowledge to wield it? When we answer that, we shall have the name of our murderer. The fog rolled aside, revealing the black bulk of Mortimer House. As we drew up to the door, Holmes's face bore that strange, cold brilliance I had seen at the brink of many cases, the look of a mind standing at the edge of revelation, poised to strike. I knew then that the candle snuffed by a breath would not long keep its secret. When we entered Mortimer House once more, the servants shrank back with a mixture of awe and dread, as though the dead master still lingered in the panelled halls. Holmes went straight to the study, Lestrade and I following. The morning light creeping through the curtains gave the room an entirely different character, less funereal yet still oppressive, as though the very air retained the echo of Sir Felix's final gasp. Holmes set the brass tube and snuffer upon the blotter with a deliberate motion, then turned slowly to face Mrs. Bell and Mr. Preece, who had been summoned at his request. You see this instrument? He asked. The secretary recoiled as though from a serpent, while the housekeeper clasped her shawl tightly. Holmes's gaze did not waver. It is the mouth by which death spoke into this room. The man who wielded it extinguished the candle not with his own breath, but with a poisoned vapor driven through this tube. Sir Felix inhaled perhaps but a single draught and his heart failed him in the instant. Preece's hands trembled. Good God, you cannot mean here, in this very house. Where else? Holmes replied sharply. The question is not whether, but who. Consider. Mr. Preece, you had the steward's key. You sat outside this very door. Had you wished, you could have risen, fitted the tube, and introduced the vapor, all without witness. Do you deny it? The man's lips moved, yet no words emerged. His complexion had turned a pallid gray, and he clutched at the back of a chair as though to steady himself. Lestrade took a step forward, sensing his chance. It looks plain enough to me. Mr. Holmes' opportunity and access, what more do we need? Holmes's hand shot out, restraining him. Patience, Inspector. We deal not in appearances but in truth, Mr. Preece. Answer if you please. I swear it, the secretary stammered at last. I never left my chair. I heard the light fail, and I was seized with dread. My master trusted me. I could not have raised my hand against him. Holmes regarded him with that peculiar stillness which is more unnerving than anger. Then, turning abruptly, he fixed Mrs. Bell with his piercing gaze. "And you, madam, you trimmed the wick and laid the snuffer ready. You alone handled the candle before it was lit. How do we know the poison was not placed there by your own hand?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might faint. But she drew herself up with an effort. "I have kept house these 20 years without reproach, sir. I would sooner cut off my own hand than harm him. If such devilry was in the wax, it was placed there unbeknownst to me." Holmes nodded slowly. "So you say. Yet the wax does not lie. It bears traces of orris and arsenic, bound into its heart. Whoever supplied such a candle knew its purpose well. The question becomes, who had knowledge of such arts? For it is not the lore of ordinary domestics or secretaries." He paced the room, his hands behind his back, while Lestrade shifted impatiently. "And what of the nephew?" I asked, seeking to relieve the tension. "Ah, yes, Percival Mortimer," Holmes said, his voice cool. "He had quarreled with his uncle that very evening. He expected inheritance, and was refused. He had motive enough for murder, yet would a dandy of the club stoop to concocting chemical vapors? Does he know arsenic from sugar? I think not. He would require a friend in the shadows, an accomplice versed in darker trades." At that moment a servant entered bearing a tray. "Beg pardon, sirs, but this was found in the scullery cupboard this morning. We thought it a tinker's rubbish, but Mrs. Bell bade me bring it." He set down a small wooden box, stained and scorched at the corners. Holmes pounced upon it like a hawk upon a mouse. He lifted the lid, and within lay a scattering of wax stubs, some blackened, some dusted with fine powder. The acrid scent I had noticed before rose sharply. "Excellent," Holmes exclaimed. "Here are the remnants of candles used for experiment. Whoever practiced his art did so within these walls." He held up one stub, its wick encrusted with grey crystals. "Watson, you see how the poison has fused here. This is no accident of chance. This is deliberate preparation." Lestrade's eyes gleamed. "Then we have him, the secretary again. Who else dwells within the house with both leisure and proximity?" Holmes shook his head. "Too easy, Inspector. Remember, the box was found in the scullery adjoins the servants' quarters. Our murderer may have sought to mislead us, or may have made use of some unsuspecting hand to hide his tools. We must trace the box to its owner before we hang the crime upon a man's neck." He turned suddenly to Mrs. Bell. "How many servants had access to this cupboard?" "All of them, sir. The maids fetch water there. The boy keeps his brushes, but none would dare meddle with strange candles." "Dare? Perhaps not, but obey perhaps so. A master with authority could compel them to store such a thing without question. I wonder, Mrs. Bell, did you see Mr. Priest or indeed your nephew about the scullery in recent days?" The woman hesitated, her brow furrowed. "Now that you speak, sir, I do recall Mr. Mortimer lingering by the back passage to mornings past. He claimed to seek the boy for errands, but I found it queer." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Queer indeed. Watson, make a note. The nephew by the scullery, the secretary with the key, the housekeeper with the wax, the courier with the sealed bag, each holds a piece of this puzzle. Our task is to fit them together." He lifted the brass tube once more, running his finger along its length. "The man who wielded this feared discovery, for he cast it away in the alley. Yet the man who prepared the candles showed patience, skill, and forethought. They may not be one and the same. We may have not a lone hand, but two, one who supplied, and one who acted." Lestrade muttered in irritation, but Holmes silenced him with a glance. "This afternoon I shall speak again with Mr. McCrae of the Home Office. He may prove more than a mere courier, for who else but a man of government might acquire poisons without question, and know how to use them unseen? Until then, Watson, guard your pen, for we tread upon treacherous ground. Each word spoken may draw the true culprit nearer or drive him to strike again." As we stepped back into the cold light of day, the house seemed to breathe behind us, its secrets unspilled, waiting for Holmes to prize them out with the unerring pressure of logic. The fog had lifted somewhat by the time we reached Whitehall, but a clammy drizzle had begun to fall, drumming faintly on the cab roof as if marking time for our uneasy thoughts. Holmes was more animated than I had seen him since the affair began. The brass tube in his pocket seemed to burn like a live coal, urging him forward. He rapped smartly upon the door of Mr. Angus McCrae's lodgings, and the courier himself, grave and taciturn, admitted us without surprise, as though he had anticipated our return. Holmes wasted no courtesy. He drew the brass tube and set it upon the small table between them. "You recognize this, I think." McCrae's brows drew together. "It looks like a piece of piping." "Why should I recognize it?" "Because," Sir Holmes said evenly, "it is no mere piping but the very instrument by which Sir Felix Mortimer was slain, and I cannot help but recall that you carried into his study a sealed bag of documents at 9:15, and left him in solitude with the candle burning. It would have been the simplest of matters for you to place such a contrivance to the keyhole in passing, and then, with the merest touch of a match, discharge the fatal vapor." The Highlander's eyes flashed with indignation, though he did not flinch. "Mr. Holmes, you insult me. My duty is to serve the Crown. I would sooner cut my own throat than betray it. You say a poisoned candle killed the man. I know nothing of such trickery. I carried the bag, I left it, and that is the end. Holmes studied him, his long fingers drumming lightly on the tabletop. No, not quite the end. The box of wax stubs found this morning proves that the preparation was made within Mortimer House, but the composition itself, arsenic and antimony oxide, is no common stock. One must procure it through official or illicit channels. I put it to you, Mr. McCrae, that a courier entrusted with government packets might have access to both. For a moment McCrae was silent. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and fierce. You wrong me. I carried the bag because it concerned a matter of finance between the Treasury and Sir Felix. He was to review certain bonds. That is all I knew. If poisons were within his house, they were placed there by another. I swear it on my name. I watched Holmes closely, for I have seen him detect lies by the faintest tremor of voice or flicker of eye. Yet, now he only inclined his head. Very well, but if you are innocent, then the guilty party would gladly let suspicion rest upon you. Consider that, and keep yourself wary. The man we seek is cunning enough to snuff a candle with death itself. When we left, I could not restrain my curiosity. Do you believe him, Holmes? Believe? No, I observe. The man's indignation was genuine, but so too was his fear. He knows more than he confesses. Whether it is guilt or knowledge of another's guilt, time will tell. We returned to Baker Street, and for the better part of the afternoon Holmes immersed himself in silent experiment, heating fragments of the poisoned wax upon a spirit lamp and watching the vapors curl through his glass tubes. At length he set them aside with a sigh of satisfaction. The method is indisputable, Watson. A single puff would fell the strongest man. Now, the question is, who constructed this? Before I could reply, there came another knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson brought in a note, sealed with a crest. Holmes slit it open and read aloud. Sir, you value your safety. Meddle no further in the affairs of Cloak Lane. The candle is but one of many lights that may be quenched. Take warning, a friend. Holmes's eyes brightened with that peculiar delight he always found in the threats of adversaries. Capital. The hand that writes in menace is the hand that trembles in fear. He seeks to divert me, therefore I am close. That evening we returned to Mortimer House under cover of darkness. The police had left, but Mrs. Bell admitted us with evident relief, as though she had kept vigil alone with her terror. Holmes lit a lamp and set about a minute inspection of the study. He measured the keyhole with his rule, compared it with the mouth of the brass tube, and nodded. He examined the mantel, the snuffer, the carpet, the window frames, never hurrying yet, never wasting a moment. Then, with sudden intensity, he dropped to the hearth and drew forth a shred of paper from beneath the grate. It was scorched at the edges, but legible in part. Guarantee of payment. Percival. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Watson, here is the first true crack in the wall. This fragment shows Sir Felix had written, perhaps drafted, a guarantee in his nephew's name. If he refused to sign it, Percival's future was ruined. A motive of the strongest sort. But could he have devised such an instrument? I asked, indicating the brass tube. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps not alone, but with the aid of one who understood chemistry. And now recall Mrs. Bell's remark of 2 mornings past, when Percival lingered by the If he met someone, there's someone who placed the box of poisoned stubs, then nephew and accomplice together could have wrought this. Just then, a floorboard creaked in the passage outside. Holmes sprang to the door, flung it open, and there stood Preece, pale and trembling. I had voices, he stammered. I thought perhaps thieves had returned. Holmes's eyes bored into him. Or perhaps you sought to learn how close we are to the truth. Be careful, Mr. Preece. The guilty man will find me less merciful than Scotland Yard. We departed shortly after, leaving the secretary visibly shaken. As we stepped into the damp night, Holmes drew his cloak tight and said quietly, "Tomorrow, Watson, we set the snare. The murderer has shown his hand in threat, in fear, and in haste. It remains only to confront him with his own device and force him to breathe the truth." The following morning broke with a hard, metallic light, the sort of London day that turns every chimney into a column of shadow. Holmes had slept scarcely 3 hours, yet when I descended he was already at the table, the brass tube and poisoned stubs arrayed before him like trophies of war. His eyes, dark-ringed from exertion, were alight with a peculiar calm determination. "Watson," he said, as though continuing a thought already spoken, "our adversary is impatient. His warning proves it. A cornered man cannot resist testing whether his hunter will recoil. We must, therefore, make him believe the chase is nearly at an end, and in that belief he shall betray himself." "And how do you propose to accomplish this?" I asked. "By staging the very moment of Sir Felix's death once more, tonight, at Mortimer House. We shall reconstruct the scene with each of our 3 chief suspects, present the nephew, the secretary, and the courier. Let them stand before the candle, and let the device itself be shown to them. The guilty man will not endure such theatre without revealing some trace of ownership." I could not help but voice my concern. "Holmes, is it not perilous to toy with a murderer armed with poison?" His lips curved into a cold smile. "Perilous, yes, but instructive. and I have no intention of letting the weapon discharge again. Leave that to me." That evening the three men arrived one by one at Mortimer House. Summoned by Holmes under pretext of final inquiries, Lestrade attended also, bristling with self-importance, though clearly bewildered by Holmes's plan. The study had been cleared, save for the escritoire upon which stood a single candle in its holder. Holmes himself directed the arrangements with an air of solemn ceremony, and when all were assembled, he addressed them. "Gentlemen and Inspector, you see before you the scene of Sir Felix Mortimer's death. Last night, as you know, I discovered this instrument." He held aloft the brass tube, its surface glinting in the lamplight. A murmur passed among the suspects. Mortimer's eyes narrowed, Priest's hands twisted together, McCrae's jaw set firm. Holmes continued, his voice deliberate. "With this, a candle was snuffed, not by natural breath, but by vapor steeped in death. Sir Felix inhaled once, and was undone. Tonight, I propose to show you how he placed the tube gently to the keyhole and lowered the snuffer upon the candle's flame. Instantly the light died, leaving only the dim glow of the lamps. A collective shiver went through the room. Holmes withdrew the instrument and set it down with measured care. "There," he said softly. Thus the act was done. "Now, which of you contrived it? Who among you possessed the knowledge, the motive, and the audacity?" For a moment silence reigned, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Then Percival Mortimer burst out, "This is absurd. I have no dealings with chemicals, nor have I need of such trickery. My uncle was obstinate, yes, but his death profits me nothing without his will." Holmes's gaze fixed upon him. "And yet a fragment of that will drafted in your favor was found scorched in the grate. Perhaps Sir Felix intended to revoke it, and you feared ruin. That is motive." The nephew paled, but held his tongue. Holmes turned to Priest. "You, sir, had the key, the very position outside the door, the chance to strike unseen. That is opportunity." Priest trembled visibly. "I was faithful to him, he trusted me. You must believe. Faithfulness is as early claimed." Holmes interrupted. He pivoted sharply to McCrae. "And you, Mr. McCrae, had access to arsenic and antimony through official channels. You possessed the means." The courier's eyes flashed. "You may throw suspicion where you like, Mr. Holmes, but I did my duty. If others tampered with poisons, I know nothing of it." The three men now stood accused in turn, their denials rising in a confused chorus. Lestrade shifted from foot to foot, muttering that one of them must surely hang. Holmes raised his hand for silence. "Enough. You see, each of you stands linked to a piece of the puzzle. Motive, means, opportunity. But the whole truth requires more than fragments. It requires the hand that held the tube." At that instant the candle, which had guttered but remained unlit, flickered suddenly as though a breath had touched it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. He had been watching closely, and I realized only then that he had arranged the flame to reveal the slightest draft. He turned, swift as a striking hawk, upon the secretary. "Mr. Priest, your involuntary gasp betrayed you. At the sight of the tube extinguishing the flame, your breath rushed forth, echoing the very crime. You, who sat at the door, trembling, were the one to fit this You, who claimed dread, were in truth rehearsing guilt." The man collapsed into the chair, burying his face in his hands. "I had never meant to kill him," he moaned. "It was only to frighten." The nephew urged. "It said a draught of vapor would weaken him, force him to sign." "I fashioned the tube, yes, but Percival supplied the poison. I thought the old man would faint, nothing more. But he gasped once and was gone." The room fell into stunned silence. Percival Mortimer's face twisted with rage and fear. "Lies, he alone devised it." Holmes's voice cut across the protests like a blade. "Lies, indeed, but yours, Mr. Mortimer. The scullery box was your doing. The chemical trace upon the wax spore orris, your chosen perfume. You provided the poison, and Priest the hand. Between you, you forged a weapon subtler than any blade." Lestrade stepped forward at once, clapping irons upon both men as they struggled and cursed. McCrae stood grim and silent, his honor vindicated at last. Holmes gathered the tube snuffer and box of wax stubs with meticulous care. As we emerged into the damp night, I could not help but shudder. Holmes, to think a single candle could carry death. He gave a thin smile. "It is ever thus, Watson. The smallest flame may light the darkest schemes, and a single breath, directed by cunning, may snuff out a life. But so too may truth, once kindled, extinguish deception. Remember that, and you will understand why I find the pursuit of crime endlessly illuminating." And with that quiet remark, he hailed a cab, leaving Mortimer House behind us at last. Its secrets exhaled into the London night. The cab bore us swiftly back to Baker Street, the night air damp against the windows, but within Holmes sat as composed as a chess player having executed the decisive move. Lestrade, flushed with the satisfaction of a double arrest, had departed with his prisoners, leaving us alone to consider the strange coils of the affair. Yet, even as I congratulated my friend on the brilliance of his deductions, I could see that familiar restlessness in his eye which told me he was not content merely with victory. "You seem unsatisfied, Holmes," I ventured. "Surely Priest's confession and Mortimer's exposure conclude the matter." "Conclude," he murmured heartily. "Their guilt is evident. but the mechanism of their union is less so. Priests had loyalty of long standing, and Mortimer, though reckless, would hardly have dared whisper of murder to his secretary bound by service. Some lever pressed them into conspiracy, until I learned what, the case remains unfinished. He rose and began pacing before the hearth, his hands clasped behind him. Mark this, Watson. Priest believed the poison would frighten, not kill. That implies he was led to suppose the vapor no more than a narcotic. Who fostered that belief? Mortimer himself, or another hand entirely? And then there is the matter of the will half-burned, never signed. Did Sir Felix intend to revoke it, or was it destroyed to mislead us? These questions still smolder, my dear fellow, and until they are quenched, I cannot lay down my pipe. I could not deny the force of his reasoning. Indeed, the more I reflected, the more it seemed that beneath the clear surface there ran a current of darker intrigue. Still, the hour was late, and I urged him to rest. To my surprise, he assented, though with that peculiar smile of his which suggested his mind would continue its labors even as his body lay still. The next morning brought a new development. A messenger from Scotland Yard arrived with a note from Lestrade. It stated, with evident pride, that Mortimer had maintained a sullen silence through the night, while Pries, after repeated questioning, had fallen into a feverish state, insisting he had been tricked. The secretary is near collapse, Lestrade wrote, but the nephew stands obstinate. The Crown's case is strong, yet if you wish further satisfaction, Mr. Holmes, you are welcome at the Yard. Holmes tossed the note aside. Lestrade is content with a rope for 2 necks, but I, Watson, am curious still. Priest's collapse may yet yield us truth untainted by fear. Shall we to the Yard? Within the hour we were seated in that grim chamber where so many wretches have unburdened themselves to justice. Priest lay upon a cot, his face damp, his lips murmuring half-formed phrases. Holmes bent low, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Courage, man. You have been made a pawn. Tell us who set you upon that path. The secretary's eyes flickered open. It was not my will. He promised me. Who promised? Holmes pressed. Percival said a draft only, that the chemist swore it safe. Holmes's gaze sharpened. A chemist, you say? What chemist? But the man only moaned and turned away, sinking again into fevered mutterings. Holmes straightened, his face set. There lies the missing piece, Watson. Mortimer could not have compounded such a vapor unaided. There is a third conspirator, a chemist who supplied the preparation and assured Priest of its harmlessness. We must find him, else the pattern remains incomplete. We sought Mortimer next. He was confined in a cell, his handsome features distorted by rage and fatigue. Holmes regarded him coolly through the bars. Your secretary names a chemist. Give me his name, and perhaps some shred of mercy may follow you to the dock. The nephew sneered. Do your worst, Holmes. I'll not drag another down with me. Let the Yard hang me if it must. I shall say no more. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Very noble. But nobility does not sit easily upon your shoulders, Mr. Mortimer. It smells of fear. You know well that your accomplice, once uncovered, will ensure you bear the heavier blame. Think on that. Mortimer turned his back, refusing another word. Holmes drew me away with a shrug. He will break, Watson, but not yet. He trusts too much in silence. No matter, we shall find this chemist without his aid. As we emerged into the bustle of Whitehall, Holmes halted abruptly, his gaze fixed upon a passing figure. It was none other than Mr. Vanes, the chemist we had consulted days before. He was engaged in animated conversation with an official of the Treasury, a packet of papers in his hand. Holmes's eyes glinted. Watson, recall how swiftly he identified the soot. He spoke of arsenic and antimony as though he had prepared them himself. Too swiftly, perhaps we followed at a discreet distance as Vanes turned into his shop. Holmes quickened his pace, and without ceremony pushed through the door. The proprietor started visibly at our sudden entrance. Mr. Holmes, you come early, earlier than you expected, perhaps, Holmes said, his voice like steel. You spoke of poisons with the familiarity of one who has dealt them, not merely studied them. Did Percival Mortimer call upon you? Did you supply him with wax and crystals? Vanes paled. I supply only for legitimate purpose, research, demonstration. Holmes slammed the brass tube upon the counter. This bears your mark. See the join, the filing here. I have seen your hand before on other instruments. Deny it if you dare. The chemist stammered, sweat breaking upon his brow. I fashioned it, yes, but for experiment only. Mortimer said it was for a harmless trick, a conjuring of candlelight. I never thought. Holmes's eyes blazed enough. You knew the vapor's power, for you told me so with your own lips. You chose to look away for the sake of coin. Mortimer may hang, but you, sir, will not escape censure. As we left the shop, Holmes's expression was grim. There it is, Watson, the hidden hand that armed the crime. Priest the instrument, Mortimer the will, Vanes the means. Together they wrought a death that seemed but a breath upon a candle. And yet, as ever, it is the smallest clue or half-moon of soot that unmasks the grandest deception. I walked beside him in silence, marveling anew at the inexorable logic that had untangled such a dark web. But in Holmes's eyes I still saw no triumph, only that cold clarity which ever drove him onward. as if each case solved were but another step along a path without end. The rain had ceased, but the street still glistened under the gas lamps as Holmes and I returned from Vaines's shop. My companion walked with his head slightly bowed, his strides long and certain, as though the entire chain of events lay already arranged in his mind. At Baker Street, he cast aside his cloak, lit his pipe, and settled into his chair, the very image of austere satisfaction. I knew better than to interrupt his silence until the smoke had formed its slow wreath about him. "Watson," he said at last, "do you perceive how close we stand to the final illumination? 3 strands have been gathered: Priest, the trembling instrument; Mortimer, the ambitious schemer; and Vaines, the venal chemist. Yet a rope is not strong merely for its strands. It is strong when they are twisted together by a single hand. The true question is, who bound them?" "You believe there is yet another?" I asked in astonishment. "Not another actor, but another intention," he corrected. "Mortimer's lust for inheritance is obvious. Priest's loyalty was perverted by deceit. Vaines's greed made him complicit. But the orchestration that required a subtle mind. I think Sir Felix himself suspected treachery and sought to counter it. That half-burned draft of a will is more telling than all their confessions. Why consign it to the grate if not to prevent its use? And why was the snuffer placed upon the mantel, unless in the murderer's haste to disguise the very tool we now hold?" I struggled to follow the rapid current of his thought. "Then you mean Mortimer was not the principal villain?" "On the contrary, he was the eager heir, but he relied upon others to lend him hands he did not possess. The chemist armed him, the secretary served him. But the design was Mortimer's still. The matter of the will troubles me. If Sir Felix had destroyed it, Mortimer would gain nothing. That is why Mortimer grew desperate, driving Priest to employ the device sooner than intended. A clumsy plot, Watson, but cloaked in a scientific novelty that deceived the senses of all but the most attentive eye." Before I could frame another question, a knock came at the door and Lestrade was shown in, dripping from the mist outside. He carried a sheaf of papers under his arm. "Holmes," he said, "I have here Sir Felix's financial records, fetched at your request. You'll see he was on the verge of withdrawing a considerable sum from his accounts, no doubt intended for that nephew of his." Holmes scanned the documents with keen interest. "Ah, precisely as I surmised. Mortimer pressed for funds, and when they were withheld, he resorted to menace. But he erred in choosing an instrument of death to find for his own comprehension. Science, when yoked to avarice, has a way of betraying its master." Lestrade cleared his throat uneasily. "Then you'll be content to let the yard proceed. We've 2 confessions of a sort and the chemist's admission. I'd call it settled." "Not until Mortimer himself speaks the final word," Holmes said, his tone brooking no dissent. "Arrange for him to be brought tomorrow to Mortimer House. There, in the study where he schemed, he shall hear the evidence arrayed, and the truth will out." The following afternoon found us once more in that somber room on Cloak Lane. The rain had washed the grime from the windows, and pale light lay across the escritoire as though cleansing it of the stain of crime. Mortimer was escorted in, his defiance much diminished since our last meeting. Holmes stood at the desk, the brass tube before him, while Lestrade and I took our places nearby. "Mr. Mortimer," Holmes began, "you see here the instrument by which your uncle perished. You procured it through Vaines, persuaded Priest to wield it, and sought to cloak the act as an accident. Your scheme has unraveled, thread by thread, until nothing remains but the naked truth. Will you persist in silence, or will you speak?" The young man's lips twisted. For a long moment he glared at us all, his eyes darting to the window as though seeking escape. At last he slumped into a chair, his voice hoarse. "It was not meant to kill him outright. I only sought to frighten him to make him yield. Priest believed as much, for I told him so. But when he gasped, when his head struck the desk, I knew it was finished. I thought to burn the draft, to cast away the tube, to silence Priest with promises. But the thing grew beyond me. You have the whole now. I shall add no more." Lestrade exhaled in triumph, but Holmes raised a hand. "One correction, Mr. Mortimer. You say you cast away the tube, yet it was found behind your uncle's house, not upon your person. That was Priest's final gesture, not yours. Even in his terror he sought to conceal what would betray you. Thus your conspiracy stands plain. Greed, weakness, and greed again. Nothing remains but justice." Mortimer made no reply, staring only at the extinguished candle upon the desk, as though mocking him with its cold silence. Lestrade gave the signal, and the constables led him away. When the room was empty, I turned to Holmes. "At last it is finished." He regarded the candle thoughtfully. "Finished for the law, Watson?" "Yes, but for the mind, there is always the lingering fascination. A breath through brass, a flame extinguished, and a life ended, yet all wrapped in a veil of simplicity. It is the kind of case that reminds me why I pursue this work, not for triumph, nor for acclaim, but for the quiet moment when the pattern resolves and the hidden hand is laid." There we stepped into the fading light of afternoon. The fog was rising once more along the river, and London, eternal and indifferent, seemed already to have forgotten Sir Felix Mortimer. But as we rode back to Baker Street, I reflected that in Holmes's mind the candle would continue to burn, its flame guttering, its breath poisoned, until the memory of this singular case joined the others in that private gallery where only he could wander, seeing in every shadow the outline of truth. The clatter of hooves along the wet cobbles followed us as the cab bore Holmes and me back toward Baker Street. For my part, I felt the case had drawn to its natural conclusion, yet Holmes sat beside me in that peculiar quiet of his gaze fixed beyond the window as though the fog itself were a veil hiding some final whisper. I have learned to mistrust that silence. It is the interval in which his mind, unsatisfied with appearances, presses relentlessly toward the last hidden seam. When at length we reached our rooms, he cast himself into his chair without removing his coat and lit his pipe. I poured the coffee Mrs. Hudson had prepared, hoping the warmth might draw words from him. It did, though not the ones I expected. "Watson, does it not strike you as curious," he began slowly, "that Sir Felix, a man cautious in all things, should consent to sit in his study with only a single candle burning, while government papers lay open before him? Why not summon lamps? Why not use the gas, had he trusted it? Why a candle, trimmed by his housekeeper, prepared with such care? He may have been eccentric," I ventured, "or cherished habit over convenience." Holmes shook his head, the smoke from his pipe curling about his sharp features. "Sir Felix was eccentric, but never careless. He must have suspected some form of tampering. That is why he insisted on the candle. He meant to watch it. Consider further. Mrs. Bell swore she placed the snuffer in the drawer, yet it was found upon the mantel. The murderer used it with the tube. Yes, but how came Sir Felix not to notice the substitution before his death, unless he himself had moved it there earlier in the evening, meaning to test his suspicions?" I frowned. "But if he suspected, why did he not call for help? Why risk his life at all?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Because he believed he could outwit the plotter. He misjudged only the potency of the poison. The half-burned draft of the will suggests he intended to disinherit Percival. He meant to confront his nephew with that fact, using the candle as bait, certain he could expose him in the attempt. But the science was darker than he knew. Thus Sir Felix Mortimer became the first victim of his own stratagem. The revelation struck me with a chill. Then he lured his killer, but was himself undone by the very trap he set." "Precisely. The irony would not have escaped him in his last conscious moment." Holmes leaned back, exhaling a thin ribbon of smoke. "The law will deal with Percival, priests, and Vanes. But the subtlety of the affair belongs not to them, but to Sir Felix, who sought to guard his fortune by cunning, and died in consequence. A man may be clever enough to weave a snare, Watson, yet still fall when the thread snaps." Before I could reply, Lestrade arrived, damped from the fog and plainly eager to hear Holmes's final word. He entered with his usual air of brisk authority, but I saw how his eyes searched Holmes's face, hoping for confirmation. "We've enough to send a lot of them before the magistrates," he said. "Mortimer for instigating, Priest for his hand, and Vanes for providing the means that will satisfy the Crown. I take it you agree." Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe with exaggerated care. "I agree, Inspector, that they are guilty as charged. But do not imagine you hold the entire truth. Sir Felix himself was the architect of his own undoing. He suspected his nephew's designs, and by some misplaced vanity in his own cleverness, he contrived to prove them. The candle, the snuffer, the very scene it was as much his contrivance as theirs. He underestimated the venom of science, and thus the snare closed upon him instead." Lestrade blinked, clearly unprepared for such an interpretation. "Well, be that as it may, the jury won't trouble themselves with subtleties. We have the culprits, and the public shall hear of their wickedness." "Indeed," said Holmes dryly, "and the public may sleep soundly again, believing murder always wears a villain's mask. But we who pry deeper know better. Sometimes it wears the mask of caution, of self-preservation, even of genius turned upon itself." When Lestrade departed, more puzzled than enlightened, I turned to Holmes. "You will not publish this conclusion, then?" He smiled faintly. "What would it serve? Justice is satisfied by the arrests. The world need not know that Sir Felix sought to bait his nephew and instead ensnared himself. Truth, Watson, is a many-layered thing. The law requires only the outer shell. I am content to keep the kernel for ourselves." That night, as I set down my notes, I reflected on the singular course of the case. A candle guttering in silence, a poisoned breath, a conspiracy of greed, and beneath it all, the shadow of a man who trusted his own wit too far. I could still see the study at Mortimer House, the faint circle of soot upon the blotter, and Holmes's long finger tracing it with the satisfaction of a geometer who has solved his proof. Holmes broke my reverie with a final remark, spoken softly as he reached for his violin. "You see, Watson, how fragile life may be, a flame, a breath, a heart's single beat. And yet, in that fragility, lies the fascination. Each case is but a candle. It burns, it gutters, it dies. What remains is a smoke the pattern left behind. That is what I read, and why I play the game." The bow touched the strings, and a low, haunting note filled the room. Outside, London's fog thickened once more, muffling the rattle of wheels and the cries of costermonger. until it seemed that all the city lay wrapped in silence, like a candle snuffed by a breath. The trial proceeded swiftly, for the evidence was overwhelming. Percival Mortimer's protestations crumbled beneath Priest's anguished admissions and Vaines's reluctant testimony. The public relished the drama of poisoned candles and secret tubes, though, as Holmes had predicted, they heard only the surface. A greedy heir, a weak accomplice, a venal chemist, Sir Felix was remembered as a victim, not as a man whose own craft had contributed to his fall. Justice, as the world understands it, was satisfied. Yet in Baker Street, as the winter days shortened and the fog grew thicker, Holmes remained contemplative. One evening he took from his drawer the small brass tube now harmless and set it on the table before us. "Observe, Watson," he said, his eyes narrowing upon it. "How easily the instrument might be mistaken for nothing more than discarded plumbing. Yet with a proper preparation it became a weapon subtler than any blade. So it is with men. The nephew, the secretary, the chemist, they seemed unlikely conspirators, yet with greed, fear, and weakness intertwined, they became more dangerous than any cutpurse with a dagger." He paused, then added, "And yet the most dangerous man of all was the one who sought to outwit his enemies and trusted too much in his own cunning. Sir Felix himself, a reminder that intellect unguided by wisdom may be as fatal as ignorance." I could not help but smile at his severity. "You are too harsh, Holmes." He was an old man, beset by schemers, and sought only to defend his fortune. Holmes's lips curved in that enigmatic half-smile of his. "Perhaps, Watson, but the candle teaches us to control a flame too closely is to risk being consumed by it. Better sometimes to trust to honest light than to fashion contrivances in the dark." He took up the tube, placed it carefully in its envelope, and consigned it to the tin box in which he kept the most singular relics of his cases. Then he reached for his violin, and the first melancholy strains filled the room. I watched him in silence, knowing that the case of the candle snuffed by a breath would soon take its place among the many strange tales that formed the hidden chronicle of Sherlock Holmes, a record of logic, folly, and the thin flame that divides life from death. Thus ended the affair of Sir Felix Mortimer, leaving me once more astonished at my friend's brilliance, and grateful that the fog of London contained not only the shadows of crime, but the clear light of a mind that could pierce them.